Okay, well, I'm quite honored and pleased to be moderating a session with two distinguished authors on American politics from different perspectives. Jonathan Darman was a journalist before, maybe he still is, before becoming a book author. He was a correspondent for Newsweek, and he covered, among other things, national presidential campaigns in 2004 and in 2008. He, most recently, has turned his attention to another political campaign in the 1960s. His new book is Landslide, LBJ and Ronald Reagan at the Dawn of a New America. So Jonathan will be talking about that and anything else we can talk him into speaking on. On my left is Chase Untermeyer, who has been a practitioner of politics. He served in the presidential administrations of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. His book, When Things Went Right, is drawn from his diary of the first years of the first Reagan administration. So, please give me a hand, help me give a hand to our two authors, and we'll get started. Jonathan, since your book comes chronologically before Chase's, I'm going to ask you a question that's kind of a twofold question. Number one is, how did you find covering the campaign of 1964 in sort of historical time after you had covered in real time the campaigns of 2004 and 2008? So that's part one of the question. And the part two of the question is, how do you perceive that politics changed in that 40-year period?
Thank you, Bill. I'm very happy to be here in Texas. Most of the places that I've been talking about the book this fall, the weather is not quite this nice. And I haven't had need of the Charlie Crist fan, which I wish we had today, under the table. But that aside, I'm very happy to be here. It's a great question. I would say that stepping back from present-day political reporting to look at the 1964 campaign has, on the most basic level, made me feel a lot more charitably toward politicians, people who are willing to step forward and run for office. When you cover a presidential campaign, we're very hard on them, and we talk about all these forces that they should be paying attention to in the country, and how hard it is for what they need to be doing to connect with the country. Stepping back and looking 50 years back in time, what you really see is it's in a lot of ways impossible to know what the country is actually dealing with in the moment. And for me, that really gets illustrated when you think about the 1964 presidential campaign. If you go back 50 years ago, this weekend, you can see sort of the next 50 years in American politics being laid out before you. On October 27th, you had Lyndon Johnson, the sitting president of the United States, who had been president for less than a year, looking forward to the next week, his landslide election to win the presidency in his own right. And he's traveling all over the country trying to get as big a margin as he possibly can. And he gets really sort of carried away in a lot of the rhetoric that he uses. He, on that day of October 27th, goes to Pittsburgh and he says, it's the time of peace on earth and goodwill among men. The time is here and the place is now. Which is, when we talk about managing expectations, it's pretty high bar to set for yourself. And meanwhile, that same day, or that same night, is the national broadcast of a underemployed, underappreciated former actor, Ronald Reagan, who was actually at that point still, people don't really think about it, a working actor, making the case for Barry Goldwater in a speech that is sort of viewed universally as Reagan's launch as a national politician, and the beginning of his sort of storied political career. So it's easy for us to look back at that split screen and say, there you have it, the sort of choice that's going to be between the two parties over the next 50 years, a sort of Johnsonian set of grand promises for all the government can do to deliver, really solve all of the problems of humankind, and then the Reagan alternative of government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. But that's a pretty impossible standard to hold Lyndon Johnson to in the moment, of understanding that this guy, Ronald Reagan, of all the possible threats out there, is in a lot of ways going to be the one who has the largest effect on his legacy. So I would say that looking at history, I hope that in my current political reporting, I'll be a little more charitable toward politicians in understanding, in the expectation of what they should understand about the country. And remind me, I'm sorry, about the second half of your question.
How has politics itself changed in the 50 years between the 64 election and the 2004 election?
It's changed in a lot of ways. My book deals with the 1,000 days after the Kennedy assassination, which, if you want to look at a moment in time where politicians actually got stuff done, as opposed to what I think we all feel like today, where they can't get anything done, it's a fantastic moment, because with Lyndon Johnson in the leadership in the presidency, you have the transformative legislation on civil rights and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You have the passage of Medicare. You have important legislation on poverty and education. And there really is this sense in both parties that you can work together and pass programs that are really going to transform people's lives. We certainly don't have that at all today. It's also, I think, and you see that one of the sort of sub-themes in the book is the passage from politics really being about that sort of Johnsonian specialty of managing the Congress and the country and the Congress being one and the same, to the importance for presidents of going beyond, of thinking about the country as a whole and beyond just the sort of parochial political machines all over the country. And the person who really understands that best is Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan first starts talking about running for governor of California in 1966, it's seen as a joke that this actor could be the best candidate the Republicans can muster for the governorship that year. It's how bad the Republican Party, the state of the Republican Party is. But what people don't realize is that Reagan's gifts of being able to communicate and being able to sort of sense the shift in mood in the country, which he's learned from his Hollywood career, are really going to be the most important assets for any politician in the decades to come.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Chase, you observe politics more or less from the inside. Jonathan and I kind of look at it from the outside. So, when did you first sense the shift that, I guess, gives rise to the title of your book, When Things Went Right? When did you, and I assume that you mean this in a double sense, things get more conservative and I gather you approve. So, how did you get drawn into politics and when did you sense the shift occurring? As early as the 60s with the emergence of Reagan, or was it closer to the time when you joined the Reagan administration?
Well, my actual origins were not with Reagan, but with his Vice President, George H.W. Bush. I was always interested in politics going back to junior high school, but the opportunity to get involved required working in campaigns, which in those days, the mid-60s in Texas, was a generally hopeless cause for Republicans. And therefore it was a delight to find this young oil man named George Bush running for Congress on the west side of Houston, which drew my time as a campaign volunteer. So I did dressing envelopes and did some campaign research, and it was a great thrill when he got elected to Congress that he invited me to be an intern on his staff. And that began a relationship that 14 years later led to going to Washington with him. At the time, I was working at the head of the avenue here as a member of the Texas House of Representatives. When the vice president-elect asked me to join his staff in the West Wing of the White House, I realized that was the end of my active career in Texas politics, so I tortured over the decision for about 0.2 of a second before accepting, resigning my seat, going off to Washington.